Let's start off by talking about the new ribbon at the top here. So if you don't see the new ribbon, I would suggest you upgrade to the latest version of Power BI Desktop. One of the things the new ribbon allows for is a simplified interface. So I have Home, Insert, Modeling, View, and Help. You'll notice the ribbon looks a lot like the ribbon in other Office products such as Word or Excel, PowerPoint. The Insert tab has a lot of the insert functionality that you'd want. So if you want to insert text box or buttons or shapes or images or other visuals, it's sort of all underneath this one tab. The other thing they've added is a new theme theme gallery functionality. So under View, I now can click here and I see a bunch of different themes that I could apply. So I can see sort of what colors are going to be applied just by looking at that theme. You can go to Theme Gallery, import some other stuff related to a theme, but it's all within the toolbar at the top. If I'd like to go into Power Query, I can go to Transform Data. So before this was Edit Queries, now this is called Edit Transform. Sorry, this is now called Transform Data. So I'll click on Transform Data, and I can transform the data, go into Power Query. The other thing I really like is the ribbon itself is more contextual. So what I mean by that is, for example, if I select a table, you'll notice that I now have table tools. So I can mark the table as a date table, or I can insert a new measure. The other thing I can do is if I select a measure, I now have measure tools related to that specific. So you'll notice the toolbar or at the top is now changing depending on what I'm selecting. Another quick tip I have is working with the advanced editor. So if on the home page, if I go to transform data, and now if I go to the advanced editor, you'll notice that all the steps I applied transforming the data are listed here. They're all also listed under the advanced editor, so I can see each one of these steps and the code associated with it. And you'll notice that it sort of goes off the edge of the dialog box here, and it's sort of hard to use. So here's a few quick tips around using this editor. So I can actually turn on line numbers. This will add line numbering. I can also turn on enable word wrap. So you'll notice now, line 4 here is wrapped, so I can see everything on the screen, which is sort of nice. I can also turn on mini maps, so I can scroll around if my transform steps are really long, and I can work a lot easier with this. Another thing you can do is edit the code directly in here. So for example, if I wanted to connect to a different company, so TWPA, let's say, is another company database I have. And you also notice the server name is here. So this allows you to take a Power BI report, transfer it to maybe another environment, change a few parameters, hit done, and you have all your steps applied. You can also keep this code, and if I'm doing the same thing to the same file month after month, or different departments, slightly different, I can change some stuff in here. So it makes it a lot easier to work with your Power BI model. I'm just going to hit done. The other important thing, if you noticed, is working with parameters within your data. So as an example, I have two parameters. I have a date parameter and a server name parameter. So I can just go in here and edit this, and you'll notice if I go back to the advanced editor, I have my server parameter listed here, and you'll notice my date parameter is listed here. So just easier to work with, and I can just change those parameters as I see fit, or add new parameters and then use them within my transform code as well. Another tip is when working with data and building your model and working with dates is that you want to build a date dimension table. And probably the easiest way to do that, as you can see in my model right now, I have dim date. I'm just going to create a new one to show you what the process looks like. So we'll go back to the Home tab and go to the Modeling tab. Just collapse this. So under the Modeling tab, I would select New Table. This will create a table for me. Now, if you do, Bing search or um, Google search, what you'll find is there's a lot of scripts out there, DAX scripts, to create the date table for you. What I had shown in the previous dim date, and the date here was calendar auto. What this does is it goes through your data set and looks at the starting date and ending date and then creates a date calendar based off of that. However, the issue with doing that is it's only going to return to you the actual date column here, and then you have to manually go in and add each one of these other columns, which, using the DAX, so dim date, date, get the month, the year, month name. In my particular data set, that's all I required. But if you want to get a lot of data returned and creating, quarters and the names of the month and all sorts of things, I'll show you how to do that here. So what you want to do is we created our new table. Just collapse this for a second. So we'll just go back to our Home tab here and still have. So on the Modeling tab, we're going to go New Table. And then we can just paste in, like I said, if you do a Google search, you can just get the actual DAX. I'm just going to paste this in here. So you'll notice that it's creating some variables. It's asking me what my start of my year is, my end year that I want to create a date for. And notice it'll create, year, short year, month number, full name, month, full abbreviation, on and on. So all of these columns, once I'm done this, and I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So now you'll notice it created this date table. I'll just rename this dim date 2. And now if I go to our dim date 2 table, you'll notice that. So my initial date, year, short year, month number, notice there's a lot more columns built into this data model. Fiscal year you can add, so this is a good way to, if you have fiscal year that doesn't align with calendar year and you want to do some analysis around that, you can definitely use a similar model. Now I could then use this date within my model. So quick way to use date. Now when you open up Power BI, one of the other things you'll notice is that under File Options and Settings, under Options, Data Load, this Time Intelligence Auto Date Time for new files, if this is left turned on, it'll automatically look at date fields or columns within your data set and then try to, so I always turn this off, and it's probably good to set this on a global setting to off and then create your own date dimension table off of that. Same thing on the data load on the current file. You can definitely turn it off there as well. And then just hit OK so then it doesn't get applied, and then you can create your own date dimensions as I indicated. Another tip is when you're building out your model, you can basically create the entire model just the way you want. Once you've completed that step, you can then publish the model up to the Power BI service. So I would then click Publish and select my workspace that I'm basically putting this into. So once I've published the data up into the workspace and I go to the Power BI service here, you'll notice that it's going into Webinar Poll workspace, and I have my report and my data set. So what this allows us to do is once we've published the report is to, if I was to open a new Power BI desktop file, I can then have other users within my organization leverage that model that I've already created to build their own Power BI desktop reports. So we'll just wait for the desktop to open here. And I can select Get Data. And one of the options I have is Power BI datasets. So I'm going to select that. And then I can start typing tips and tricks model. So that was published. I can select it, hit create. So notice I have no tables listed, and now all the tables jump from my model that I had, my dataset model, jump into the report, and I can easily start using these within, my model here. So I can do something like country, sales by country. So this is, end users don't necessarily need to know how to build the model. They can consume it and work with the data, build their own visuals, dashboards, reports off of that data. The one thing I would mention is that once you've sort of published that model, you don't want to go in and start making changes to it, like, renaming columns and stuff like that, because that could affect other individuals who've already built stuff off of it. So you want to have a very mature model that you're working with. But I can also take the initial model and then start adding things to this. So as an example, I can go into the model here, very similar. I can add other tables and link those in here into this data set. One of the other things to be aware of is when you republish this report back up, it's going to go back into that whatever workspace that I had. So if I, named it something different, it's going to get published within into this workspace. Another tip is using the format painter. So let's say I have two visuals on a page here. What I can do is select my first visual, and let's say I want to do, change the title, let's say to font color to be red. Let's center it, and let's change the font size to be 11. So instead of going through all those steps again on the second visual, I can just select the visual I want, select Format Painter, and click on the second visual, and now it's applied the same changes. But you'll notice if I had other changes, they would also get applied to the second visual. So just be aware of that. But it's just a nice tool to make it faster to build dashboards and reports. Another tip is building a slicer pane that hides and shows depending on different actions using bookmarks. So how this works is, as an example, I have a report here, and if I click on this, hold the control key and click on this button, I get a box that pops up with two different slicers in it. So I have a country slicer and a year slicer in here. And if I then click on this button, I can hide that particular box, and that's done through bookmarks. So the way you build that is first thing I would do is create a object on the page. So as an example, I'm just going to duplicate this page. So here's a slicer on the page. Like I said, I have two different slicers with the rectangle in the background. So to do that, I'm just going to go to Insert, select the shape, insert a rectangle. There's my rectangle, and then I just, like I said, dragged my two slicers on top of that. Once I've done that, next thing I'm going to do is select all the different objects. So I'm going to go to my selection pane, and I can see that I have all of these objects are selected. So if I unselect these, I'm going to ungroup this to show you how I went about grouping it. So I have this button which is outside the slicer. I have this button which is inside the slicer. I'll move this down just so you can see it. And then I have one slicer, other slicer, and my shape. So I can hold the control key and select all of these objects, right click, and I can group these together. I can then double click on this and give it a name. So slicer pane. Once I've done that, I can, turn that on, turn that off. So this is just a quick way to group stuff together so it's visible on the page. And I can also change the order, so I can change the Z order of stuff and sort of hide stuff in the background or have stuff show over top of. So the higher it is in the list, the higher the Z order or the lower the Z order is of that object. So the slicer pane is showing here on the page. Next thing I do is once I have the slicer object created is creating bookmarks. So under bookmarks, I have two different bookmarks. I have show, slicer pane, and hide. So if I select, I'm going to delete both of these just so I can show you how I did this. So what I want to do is select my slicer pane, which is visible, add a bookmark, give it a name. So this will be show slicer pane. Next thing I want to do is hide the slicer pane. So I'm just going to turn that off, add another bookmark, and give it a name, which is hide. So now I have two slicers. I can show or hide the different bookmarks. Next thing I want to do is sort of wire up the buttons, which is show slicer and hide slicer. So the way I do that is to add a button, obviously, is under insert button, and then I just added these two buttons. But to wire these up, I'm just going to click on this. Under action, under visualization, I have the type, select bookmark, change that to, so this will show the slicer, and then I can give it a tooltip. So if I hover over it, you'll see it says show slicer. And then I did the same thing with this button here, which is hide the slicer. And gave it a tooltip as well. So it's really that simple to wire up your slicer or your bookmarks to buttons. And you see this is visible on top of the other objects on the page. So let me just hide these two things. I'll just click off of here. The other thing you want to make sure you do is when you're creating the two slicers is under the view, under the selection pane, I want to ensure that in the bookmarks is I want to turn off the data option on both of these. And the reason being is if I have different selections selected, I don't want these slicers to reset themselves. I just sort of want them to hide and go away as I click on different elements here. So I want to make sure I turn off the date option for both of these bookmarks. So once I've done that, I can then click on show the hold the control key, click on it, show the slicer, click on the button to hide the slicer. So this allows for me to have more visuals on a page that I can use, and then I can also have a pop-up slicer pane that has way more slicers in it, and it makes creating reports and visualization of reports much simpler. Another tip is working with measures. So let's assume I'm creating a new measure. So I'm just going to exit out of here. So we'll go to Data, Modeling tab, New Measure. I'll just call this test equals, and I'll start typing my DAX formula. So as an example, let's do some sales, and then we'll apply a filter, let's say by country. But let's just say that I didn't want to do this. I can actually use the Control Z functionality, and I can back out of the previous step in my calculation, or Control Y to reapply the future steps. So works very similar to other Office applications. Control Z to undo, Control Y to redo. So another tip is using Rowlevel security. So under the modeling tab, what I can do is click on Manage Roles. Just delete this. I've already created it. So basically, I just create a role, select the table, and then put in the DAX formula. So I'm just going to do country equals can. Hit save. So what happens now is I'm just going to change the view here, select none of the roles. So this is how I normally would see it, but I could click on View As and then select that specific role that I've created, which is Canada. So the way this works is once I've created the report in the Power BI desktop application, I publish it up to the service. I then can assign specific users of the Power BI service to specific roles. Those roles would then limit which data they can see. So as an example, I'm viewing this as Canada role right now. And if I click on the actual data as well, you'll notice that I'm only seeing the Canadian data set. So visuals are obviously filtered, plus the data is filtered to that specific role. So it's a way to restrict, you could have sales territories or sales regions or salespeople seeing certain subset of data, or only data pertains to the stuff that they're managing. Webinar recap. We reviewed the new ribbon in Power BI Desktop, showed some tips related to the advanced editor. We reviewed using a date dimension, how to reuse your model, viewed tips around bookmarks, using bookmarks to hide objects, row level security, and some tips around visual formatting.